There comes a moment when heaven no longer waits, not because God has lost patience, but because patience has already completed its work. For a long time you lived inside a silence that tested your faith. You prayed while nothing moved. You endured while someone else manipulated without consequence. You watched arrogance speak loudly while truth remained unseen, and slowly, without realizing it, you were pressured to believe that justice had an expiration date. It does not. What you experienced was not God's absence, it was restraint. Not weakness, but authority held back. Not indifference, but deliberation. There are seasons when God allows human character to fully reveal itself, where no one is rushed, no one interrupted, and no excuse remains unspoken. In those seasons, the righteous are refined and the corrupt are measured, not by a single mistake, but by repeated choice, not by what is said in public, but by what is done when no one is watching. You were not imagining the imbalance. You were not too sensitive. You were not wrong to feel that something was deeply unjust. You were standing at the edge of a moral reckoning that had not yet surfaced. And now, something has shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but decisively. When divine judgment arrives, it does not announce itself with chaos. It enters quietly, removing restraint, lifting protection, and allowing truth to function without interference. What once seemed untouchable begins to falter. What once relied on control begins to lose traction. The very strategies that sustained deception stop working in a world suddenly governed by order. This is not about vengeance. This is not about emotional release. This is about authority returning to its rightful place. When God takes control, the narcissist's game does not evolve, it ends. Not because you confronted them, but because deception cannot survive where truth is permitted to breathe. What once dominated begins to collapse under its own weight, and the silence that once confused you now reveals its purpose. That realization leads naturally into a question many people struggle to voice. Why did God allow it to last so long in the first place? Why judgment did not come sooner? One of the most difficult questions a person can carry, especially after enduring prolonged manipulation, is not whether God is just, but when that justice will finally arrive. Time has a way of distorting faith. When wrongdoing appears to go unanswered long enough, people begin to wonder if moral order still exists at all, or if it has quietly been replaced by chaos disguised as freedom. But divine judgment does not operate on emotional timelines. God does not react, He weighs. What appears to us as delay is, in reality, examination. God does not judge a single incident in isolation. He observes patterns. He watches how a person responds to correction, to loss, to truth spoken gently before it must be spoken firmly. He allows room not because wrongdoing is acceptable, but because character must be fully revealed before it can be rightly addressed. The narcissist often misunderstands this period entirely. They interpret patience as approval, silence as weakness, opportunity as entitlement. Each moment without consequence becomes, in their mind, evidence that they are untouchable. And so they continue refining manipulation, deepening deception, expanding control, never realizing they are not escaping judgment, only documenting it. There were moments when everything could have changed, moments when discomfort invited reflection, moments when losing you could have led to humility rather than resentment, moments when truth brushed against conscience and asked for a response. But narcissism does not merely ignore truth, it reframes it as a threat. Accountability becomes persecution, boundaries become betrayal, and repentance never arrives, because self-examination would collapse the carefully constructed self-image. At this point, there is nothing to explain and nothing to justify. Divine judgment does not require agreement, it reveals itself. If you understand this truth, acknowledge it simply by writing, God's judgment is just. Not in anger, not in accusation, but in reverence for an order higher than human timing. God's delay also serves a purpose that is easy to miss while you are suffering. While the narcissist is being measured, you are being prepared. While they are revealing who they are through repetition, you are being detached from dependence. Your confusion slowly gives way to discernment. Your silence shifts from fear to strength. What once kept you bound emotionally begins to loosen, not because they changed, but because you did. Judgment does not arrive while attachment still clouds perception. It comes after separation has done its quiet work, after excuses no longer persuade you, after you no longer need answers from the very person who withheld truth. Only then can consequences unfold without dragging you back into the storm. This is why judgment often feels sudden when it finally appears, not because God moved abruptly, but because the groundwork was laid patiently, over time, out of sight. When restraint is lifted, reality does not rush, it simply proceeds without interference, and when that happens, the protection that once prevented collapse is no longer present to hold things together. As that restraint is withdrawn, a noticeable shift occurs, not in you, but around the one who relied on it, signaling the beginning of a phase where exposure is no longer preventable and outcomes are no longer negotiable. When God withdraws restraint, the most feared form of judgment, there is a form of divine judgment more sobering than punishment and more final than correction, and it is rarely recognized while it is happening. God does not always judge by intervening. Often he judges by withdrawing what once restrained the consequences of a corrupted will. This is not abandonment, it is exposure. For a season, sometimes a very long one, God allows even deeply disordered lives to remain intact. Structures hold, relationships endure, opportunities continue to appear. The narcissist interprets this as evidence of superiority, intelligence, or destiny, but what they mistake for personal brilliance is often mercy they neither earned nor understood. C.S. Lewis warned that the most dangerous illusion a soul can hold is the belief that it is self-sufficient. In The Problem of Pain, he observed that God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain, not because he delights in suffering, but because pain is often the only language pride understands. What Lewis implies, though many overlook, is that before pain comes, restraint must be lifted. Divine restraint is the unseen force that softens consequences. It is what keeps systems from collapsing when they should. It is what delays exposure when truth has already been violated. It is what allows charm to function longer than it deserves to, and it is always temporary. When God withdraws this restraint, there is no announcement, no warning, no dramatic sign in the sky. Life simply begins to respond honestly to what has been planted within it. The narcissist does not feel judged at first. They feel confused. The same strategies no longer produce the same outcomes. The same words no longer persuade. The same presence no longer commands. Influence fades without explanation. This is the moment when manipulation begins to fail, not because anyone has confronted it, but because it can no longer hide inside tolerance. What once worked in silence now collapses under daylight. The narcissist searches for enemies, betrayal, conspiracies, anything that preserves the illusion of control. They do not consider that the order they have been violating has quietly returned. Lewis understood this condition well. He wrote that hell begins with a grumbling mood, always complaining, always blaming, until the soul becomes permanently enclosed within itself. When restraint is withdrawn, That enclosure begins to tighten. The narcissist is left increasingly alone, not physically, but morally. Fewer people intervene, fewer people excuse, fewer people absorb the cost of their behavior. And because their identity was built on dominance rather than truth, they have no internal structure strong enough to survive this isolation. What collapses first is not their circumstances, but their coherence. Their narrative begins to fracture, their justifications contradict each other, their image no longer matches their outcomes. This phase of judgment feels impersonal because it is. God does not need to accuse, reality does the work. Consequences proceed without malice, without urgency, without negotiation. Patterns reach completion. Trajectories arrive where they were always headed. What was hidden is no longer protected. For you, this stage often unfolds at a distance. You are no longer positioned inside the system that is unraveling. You are not summoned to explain, testify, or defend the truth. Your absence is part of the judgment itself, not as revenge, but as removal from contamination. God does not require your participation in exposure. He requires your separation. And as restraint continues to lift, something inevitable begins to surface, not through force, not through confrontation, but through clarity. Truth, once delayed, is no longer prevented from speaking, and when it does, the game that depended on distortion cannot survive much longer. When truth is no longer restrained, the game ends. There comes a phase in divine judgment when truth no longer needs to be defended, clarified, or argued. It does not arrive as accusation. It does not announce itself with confrontation. It simply resumes its proper function. And when truth is finally allowed to operate without obstruction, the narcissist's game does not collapse dramatically. It stops working altogether. For a long time, deception survives not because it is strong, but because it is accommodated. People overlook contradictions. They excuse inconsistencies. They soften what feels wrong because confronting it would be costly. Truth is present, but delayed by tolerance. And tolerance, when repeatedly abused, eventually withdraws. When God removes restraint, truth does not rush in violently. It settles, it stabilizes. It exposes not by shouting, but by remaining consistent while deception grows frantic. Stories no longer align. Explanations multiply. Justifications become increasingly complex, and yet nothing new has been revealed. What changes is that reality stops cooperating with distortion. The narcissist experiences this not as exposure, but as loss of control. Words that once persuaded now raise doubt. Authority that once intimidated now invites scrutiny. Relationships that depended on imbalance begin to strain under the weight of coherence they were never built to carry. This is not punishment, it is alignment. Life begins to respond honestly to the character shaping it. Truth does not humiliate, it clarifies. And clarification is devastating to a false self. When actions and words are finally measured against each other, the gap becomes impossible to ignore. Trust does not collapse suddenly, it erodes quietly, as people no longer invest energy in sustaining contradictions. At this stage, the narcissist often feels persecuted without being opposed. They sense rejection without being attacked. They feel exposed without anyone speaking against them. This is because divine judgment does not require witnesses. Truth itself becomes the evidence. The environment changes, access narrows, influence diminishes. Support thins not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. For those who once carried the weight of explaining, defending, or absorbing the cost of deception, this phase feels strangely distant. You are no longer required to speak. You are no longer asked to clarify what has become obvious. Your absence is not avoidance, it is placement. God does not involve you in exposure when truth has already taken the lead. This is why the end of the game feels quiet. No verdict is announced, no apology is issued, no restoration is offered where repentance is absent. The narcissist is left confronting a world that no longer bends around their version of events. And that realization, slow, unavoidable, and deeply unsettling, opens the next movement of divine judgment, where separation reveals its true meaning, and your removal is finally understood not as loss, but as protection already accomplished. Your separation was not abandonment, it was protection. There is a painful misunderstanding many people carry long after separation has occurred. They believe distance means loss, silence means erasure, and removal means failure. But divine judgment does not remove what is essential. It removes what is corrosive. When God separates, He is not undoing your life. He is preserving it. You were not taken out of the narcissist's reach because you were weak. You were removed because remaining would have required you to become someone you were never meant to be. Prolonged exposure to manipulation does not simply wound the heart. It distorts the soul's sense of truth. God does not ask His people to survive by surrendering clarity. Separation is not punishment for loving too much. It is protection from being reshaped by what refuses repentance. When God intervenes at this level, He is not negotiating with circumstances. He is enforcing boundaries that you were never meant to maintain alone. What felt like loss at the time was actually a decisive act of containment. The narcissist experiences your absence very differently. To them, separation feels like theft. Control is removed. Influence evaporates. Access disappears without explanation. What they once extracted freely, attention, validation, emotional labor, is no longer available. And because their sense of self was reinforced through domination, your removal destabilizes far more than a relationship. It exposes dependency they never acknowledged. This is why separation often triggers escalation on their side, not because they miss connection, but because they have lost leverage. The absence of reaction unsettles them more than confrontation ever did. Silence becomes intolerable because it offers no surface to manipulate. Distance becomes threatening because it cannot be invaded. But God does not separate to provoke reaction. He separates to restore order. When you were inside the system of distortion, clarity required constant defense. Boundaries demanded explanation. Truth felt exhausting. Once removed, clarity becomes effortless. You no longer have to prove what was real. Reality begins to support you instead of draining you. This is the quiet mercy hidden inside judgment. God does not require you to remain present for consequences to unfold. He does not assign you the role of witness, enforcer, or moral counterweight. He relocates you before collapse intensifies, because His concern is not spectacle, it is stewardship of what still bears life. Separation also reveals something difficult to accept. The narcissist's access to you was never guaranteed. It was permitted for a time, then withdrawn. What they interpreted as entitlement was always conditional. And when God removes permission, there is no appeal process. Distance becomes permanent, not by declaration, but by design. For you, this phase often feels anticlimactic. There is no dramatic vindication, no moment of triumph, only relief mixed with clarity. You begin to see that what you lost was not safety, but illusion. What you gained was not escape, but placement positioned where manipulation can no longer reach you. As separation settles into permanence, another realization begins to surface on the other side. The narcissist does not merely lose access to you, they lose the mirror that sustained their identity. And when that absence becomes undeniable, they are forced to confront a truth they avoided for years. Control was never the same thing as power, and without you, The illusion they lived by begins to fracture from within, setting the stage for what they recognize far too late. What the narcissist realizes always too late. There is a realization that arrives at the end of divine judgment, and it is not the one the narcissist expects. It is not regret in the way people usually imagine it. It is not sorrow that leads to repentance. It is awareness, cold, unmistakable, and irreversible. The awareness that what they believed was power was never power at all. For a long time, control masqueraded as strength. Influence felt like authority. Attention felt like importance. The narcissist mistook reaction for relevance and obedience for loyalty. As long as others responded, adapted, explained, or endured, the illusion held. They believed they were central. They believed they were necessary. They believed they were untouchable. But divine judgment dismantles illusions by removing their supports. When you were removed, the structure collapsed inward. Without resistance to dominate, without emotion to harvest, without presence to manipulate, the narcissist was left with something they had avoided for years: themselves, not the image, not the narrative, the self behind the performance. This is the moment that arrives too late. They begin to realize that you were not easily replaceable, not because you were perfect, but because you were real. You brought coherence where they brought chaos. You brought substance where they brought performance. And while they told themselves anyone could take your place, reality proves otherwise. New sources do not stabilize them. They distract briefly, then fail. The same emptiness resurfaces, unchanged. This is not because God is cruel. It is because God is exact. Judgment does not give the narcissist what they want, it gives them what they built. A life dependent on extraction eventually runs out of supply. A self constructed through domination cannot survive without someone to dominate. And when God allows that structure to stand alone, its weakness becomes impossible to deny. What unsettles them most is not losing you, it is losing the belief that they were in control. They begin to see patterns they once dismissed, relationships that followed the same arc, outcomes that repeated despite changing faces, conflicts that always ended the same way. For the first time, the common denominator becomes visible. But this realization does not bring peace, it brings disorientation. Because to acknowledge the truth would require repentance, and repentance would require surrender, and surrender would require the death of the false self they protected at all costs. Divine judgment does not force that death, but it makes avoiding it impossible. The narcissist is left at a crossroads they cannot bypass. For you, this awareness happens at a distance. You do not hear it confessed. You do not witness it expressed cleanly. It appears indirectly in instability, in restlessness, in repeated attempts to regain relevance that no longer work. Their world continues to shrink, not because you cursed it, but because it was built on a foundation that could not endure separation. This is why the realization comes too late, not because God delayed truth, but because the narcissist delayed humility. By the time awareness arrives, access has closed, influence has expired, and what remains is not an opportunity to repair the past, but a confrontation with the present they created. As this awareness settles, one final contrast becomes unavoidable. While they are left facing the consequences of what they built, something entirely different is unfolding for you quietly, steadily, without drama. What judgment removed from their life has cleared space in yours. And that clearing is not emptiness, it is preparation. Your rise, restoration, without noise. There is a quiet cruelty in the way suffering tries to convince you that pain is your permanent address. It whispers that you will always be the person who had to survive, always the one who had to recover, always the one who had to explain what happened. But divine judgment does not end with collapse on one side. It ends with restoration on the other. And restoration is rarely loud. God does not rebuild people the way the world rebuilds reputations. The world repairs appearances. God repairs foundations. The world offers distraction. God offers deliverance. And deliverance is not merely being spared from a person, it is being freed from the internal distortions that person tried to plant inside you. You may not have noticed it at first, but a new kind of order has been forming in you. You no longer chase clarity from those committed to confusion. You no longer interpret disrespect as a test of patience. You no longer bargain with what consistently violates truth. The very places where you once tried to prove your worth now feel beneath you, not because you are proud, but because you have been returned to your proper measure. Restoration looks like this. You breathe without bracing. You sleep without scanning the room in your mind. You make a decision without rehearsing how it will be used against you. You laugh without calculating the consequences. You begin to sense that peace is not fragile, it is solid. It does not depend on someone else's mood. It does not require constant management. It rests on the simple fact that God is not negotiating with chaos in your life anymore. What divine judgment removed was not love. It removed a counterfeit that demanded your life as payment. And once removed, you begin to understand something that reshapes everything. You were never meant to live with your spirit constantly on defense. You were meant to live with your conscience clean, your mind clear, and your soul anchored. This is also why your healing does not need an audience. The narcissist's world required witnesses, applause, reaction, control, proof. God's restoration requires none of that. It often happens in ordinary days, in small choices, in quiet mornings, in the slow relearning of safety. You discover that holiness is not spectacle, it is alignment. And alignment produces stability. In time, you will recognize that God did not only separate you from a person, He separated you from a pattern. He separated you from cycles that would have repeated. He separated you from the kind of spiritual fatigue that turns good people into exhausted people. And He did it not to punish you, but to preserve what He still intends to bring forth. This is why you do not need to keep looking back for a final scene. Divine judgment does not always give you a visible ending. Sometimes the ending is simply that you are no longer there. Sometimes the closure is that you are no longer available. Sometimes the verdict is that your life has moved beyond the reach of what once controlled it. And while the narcissist is left confronting the emptiness created by their own choices, you are being filled with something they could never manufacture. Peace that is not performative, strength that is not aggressive, dignity that does not depend on winning, and clarity that does not require argument. You will not always feel the moment restoration begins, because it begins the way dawn begins, quietly, faithfully, without asking permission from the night. But you will recognize it by the simplest evidence of all. You are no longer shrinking. You are no longer bracing. You are no longer surviving. You are living. And that is the part divine judgment was always moving toward, not your revenge, not your triumph, but your return. Divine judgment is often misunderstood because people expect it to look like spectacle. They expect noise, confrontation, visible punishment. But God does not govern the world through theatrics. He governs it through order. And when order is restored, everything finds its proper place, including you. What has unfolded was never about proving who was right or wrong in the eyes of others. It was about truth being allowed to stand without distortion. It was about restraint being lifted at the precise moment when mercy had finished its work. And it was about separation occurring not as loss, but as preservation. You were not spared because you were flawless. You were spared because you were willing to remain honest in a system built on distortion. God does not protect perfection. He protects integrity. And when integrity is threatened long enough, judgment becomes an act of care. There will be no final argument to win, no dramatic apology to receive, no public vindication required. Divine judgment does not need your participation to be complete. It simply restores balance and then moves forward.